Hello. This week, third week, I'm giving you a PowerPoint on definition of culture. There's no blackboard. There's no written assignment this week. I hope you're okay with that. We do have a written assignment on about 2.5 weeks. I'll need to put up some information for you on that. But today's discussion is really kind of fun. I like it. And it's the idea of culture. And of course, I'm teaching you, and then you're going to be teaching someone else, some kids or maybe some other adults. And the term culture is bandied about. People say, well, that's not very cultural, or that's crude, or it's, we have the term multicultural, and people that lived in two cultures like Hispanic and Arabic, grew up with the parents from each side. They would be bicultural. One of the interesting things is that words themselves are artifacts. And I'm not just talking the words in Webster's dictionary or Funk and Wagnall. I'm talking any words, any utterances that become used by people. Okay, I guess belching is not well, actually, even that's cultural, because some cultures it's rude, and other cultures it's acceptable, and others they don't care. There are all kinds, and we talk about cultures, and we often attach the word ethnicity to it, or a certain nation, or sometimes a certain group of people in a group have a shared culture. We have the term deaf culture, talking about those with, and I have to be careful with these terms. If I say hearing impairment, one of the things I want to remind you is anytime we talk about another culture, it's always good to spend a little time finding out so that you don't offend people in the culture or any kind of mistakes. When I deal with individuals, I want to find out what the language is. We have new terms, not brand new, but in the last 40 years, we have terms like feminist studies. You never had feminist studies in the 1950s. You had the term gay. The term gay when I was a kid was pretty much happy or happy-go-lucky or something like that. Had nothing to do. It wasn't at that time in the general culture used to identify someone's sexual orientation. And it might have been used, and sometimes a word is used in, it's improper. When I was a kid, you could not use the word queer. Or if you did it in the really old saying, but then when it was used as an insult or slang, or to try to humiliate or bully someone, then the word had a totally different context. And the interesting thing is, and I put the definition in here, I'll just repeat that. Culture is basically anything human beings touch. What they name, what they do, what they believe. Gosh, I forgot my own definition now. See, I'm forgetful. I'm gonna declare myself a little bit. Well, where did I put it? Oh yeah, what people know and believe, what they do, and what they make and use. I really almost think it's anything that human beings touch. Name it, conceive of it, argue about it, whatever, it's culture. Sometimes use that term culture like, well, there's high culture and low culture, and something's better. A lot of people would say, oh, opera, that's culture. Something in the Prado in Spain, or in the Louvre in Paris, art, that's culture. But you have no culture, the insult. There is no such term, actually. You can't say you have no culture. Well, legally you can, freedom of speech or whatever, or if you want to insult somebody. But the word culture is so ubiquitous that it's virtually um, um, it qualifies wherever people are, whatever they're talking. If I confused you, I confused myself. But I wanted to, the idea that when you're dealing with kids, you want them to understand that culture is, except for the scientific version, that culture is everywhere. I've got a weird collection of things in my office. You probably notice I'm unusual myself. This is cultural AC/DC, you know, back in the black AC/DC. I actually like AC/DC, but I couldn't remember which songs they had. I had to go on YouTube and get them so I could just listen through them one day, the playlist, say, okay, now I remember which songs are AC/DC and which ones are Rush, that, and which ones are Metallica, etc. The cool thing about a group when they have their culture is they very carefully to define the boundaries of it. As I mentioned, they have all kinds of words or languages, terms that they use. We might call them slang if they're not used commonly, or if they're just used in certain situations. I like to collect all kinds of odd things. I got this book, which when I was a kid, this game was very popular. Now it's been a few years. It's called Authors, and all you do, it's basically you're trying to match up people. There's Mark Twain, and you would ask for Mark Twain, and then somebody in their hand would have to give you any Mark Twain cards, and you'd match them up, just the same as if you had aces and queens and kings and stuff like that. But what was cool about it is I learned culture, because then I'd say, I can actually remember this, Alfred Lord Tennyson, which most of you never read or hear about. He wrote Crossing the Bar, the Brook, and the Charge of the Light Brigade in Idylls of the King. Okay. He also wrote Ivanhoe, but they didn't put it on his card. Charles Dickens. And the thing here is that while you were basically playing a card game, you also learned about high culture. And because of that, I knew who wrote what for a lot of major authors. And when the game Jeopardy came on, I kind of cleaned up at first. Nowadays, it's hard because I'm older and I didn't watch all that much television in the 90s and more recently. That's one example of culture. It has high culture in it. There's also the term, and people use these, objective culture and subjective culture. A good example would be tamales. You probably like tamales. I do too. But if you know about tamales in Hispanic culture, and when I say Hispanic, I mean Mexico mainly. I don't claim to know about other countries. Spain, they don't do tamales. That's Mexican food. And if you can correct me if I'm wrong, because as an informant of a culture, I'm just generally shooting in the dark, hoping I'm right. A tamale is something you eat. That's objective. It's a piece of food. It can have pork or beef, whatever. But it has a subjective aspect to it. And that term is not the rigid definition of the object, but the culture and the way it's used. For instance, I was talking to a friend yesterday, and he mentioned that their family makes a lot of tamales once a year. I don't recall exactly when it was, but I remember that he said they would have a huge pot, cook the meat, prepare the sauces in there, and then they would get out the corn husks, and they made 200 tamales. And that was an event. The whole family came together. They had a big pot. He said the pot is so big that a little kid could stand in it and hide in it because it was that big. But the actual making of the tamales is a special event that involves a family, and it's a social activity. So the term culture, subjective culture, means the wider representation of what it means. I've got here a bottle. And for some of you, you may look at this and say, is that an old medicine bottle? And some of you, if you really know history, Western history, you'd recognize this is called a coffin whiskey flask. I paid $6 for it about 15, 18 years ago. It's from Fort Sidney, Nebraska. And the soldiers at the fort got cheap whiskey, and it came in these kind of bottles. Now, I don't know why they call it a coffin whiskey. I guess it's kind of large at the top and tapers off like a coffin. But this was dug up there. It's even got the little cork in it. It's all dried up. Nothing left to drink. So this was dug up. It's an artifact. It's an objective artifact. But what is it? It tells us something more. Culturally and subjectively, the soldiers would drink a lot. Soldiers drink a lot. Part of the culture was alcohol. And this was a time when America, it was quite a few years before Prohibition, but people were concerned about alcoholism in the United States, how it was destroying families. And there were temperance unions, which was a group of not just women, but a lot of women, and often with church association. They were trying to put a stop to liquor sales. If you ever purchase beer, you know there are some states, there are all kinds of rules about beer. Some of them you can buy beer by the bottle and walk out with it. Others you have to buy it and you can't open it and you have to take it home. If it's on Sunday, you can't buy it at all. But there's a whole culture, a whole aspect of subject. When they say subjective, it means that it's not that simple. There's a lot more to it than that. Human beings love to have things black and white when they want things black and white. But when they want ambiguity, they want ambiguity. You know, people that like to drink like to have different rules for liquor at different places. They like to have it just wide open all the time. They don't get it. But we know politicians have to have their positions in as many ways as possible so they can get the most votes. We saw it with the health care vote. Are you for health care, Obamacare, they call it? Are you against it? And then when it got time to repeal or to make some changes, some people started, well, not exactly. I don't quite want to change it that much. So what does that mean? Does that mean politicians lie? Well, yeah, probably. Probably do people lie, or do they smudge the the complexity? Of course they do. People don't want it black and white all the time. They just, they want it like they want it, whatever it is. Our cultures are like that. As you go through this, it'll talk about different cultures. I have another PowerPoint that talks about, concept of time in one culture versus another culture, a concept of social grace, I would call it, or, being civil to people. We don't see it in Congress much or in life on the street a lot. We talk about people in New York City. They don't have time for people. They're not very civil or something like that. But that you have to understand, of course, all these are within the context of the speaker or the one doing the criticizing. People don't like a certain place, they'll say negative things about it. If somebody doesn't like cowboys, I remember some of your statements. I remember one, Ogallala was the cowboy capital of Nebraska. But I've read this, cowboys and having lived in Oklahoma and have some relatives from Texas, they like to pretend they're cowboys, but they live in cities and they've never worn a cowboy hat. They don't have the hat and they don't have the cattle. But what's interesting about it is that I grew up as a kid, I thought cowboys were the most noble people on the earth. They were independent, they were virtuous, they rescued people, they were like the knight in shining armor. There's Roy Rogers. And then in the 70s, 60s and stuff, we got Clint Eastwood playing a cowboy of a sort. And then he'd pull a gun and shoot a bunch of guys down and say, wow, that guy can really kill a lot of people. And they deserved it. And then we got movies where people got killed. Maybe they did deserve it, but the guys are cowboys. And then it got kind of confusing. I said, well, I guess there's some bad cowboys, because you get this simplistic view and you think, we all like to think all teachers are good. And we as teachers love that stereotype. I mean, we want to think all college professors, all teachers, all principals are people dedicated to doing what's best for students and being honest and stuff. And then we find exceptions. The same thing with the issues with police in our culture. Depending on where you grow up, you may have a different attitude about police. I had a really different attitude about cowboys. Then I realized not all cowboys were our friends, as a kid. And I'm using an example that's pretty safe and neutral. Most people aren't going to call up and complain that I've insulted cowboys. But we do know that with different ethnic groups, but they use the term race, and I'm going to tell you the term race is really useless. We use it to define people by skin color or something. It used to be even by physical features. But the fact is that we are so genetically close, it's meaningless. But we still fall back on it because I think mainly skin color. But it's really interesting that people get stereotypes, and I'll talk about that more in the class. But culture involves the negotiation of meaning. We try to decide in our viewpoint, our group, we want to have the rules set up. But then we have these other cultures. And in the PowerPoint, I show different cultures in America. But they're mainly set up by ethnic. I really don't like the PowerPoint very much. It was from another time. And I think it's just, too ambiguous nowadays to really kind of nail it down other than the simple definition of culture. But it looks to me that we as educators interacting with other groups, it's incumbent on us, I like that word incumbent, he's running again for office, but it's incumbent on us to search out other cultures and to think about how we think about our own culture. I mean, our rules are very ambiguous. I mentioned that thing about we like it black and white, very simple. It's a term people like. The law is the law. You're in the country, you're either here legally or you're not here legally. But of course, we know that in this issue of the Dreamers, and it's very close to me, my friend I talked to the other day is a person protected by the DACA, the DACA Act that was under Obama, and Trump may, do something with it on Tuesday. But this is causing terrible stress because you're thinking 800,000 people that came here as kids who are considered too young to have made a decision to so-called break the law, that they could just be systematically hunted down and deported. And they would lose their driver's license and everything. Now, that's something I'm telling you about because it's something in my ESL world that is very important to me in ESL culture. But this, the concept of, it's you're either legal or illegal. The terms concept of legal and illegal being applied to a human being's existence in a certain space. For some people, that's not an issue. I mean, it's very simple. And they just say, they have to leave. Of course, we have the law and the spirit of the law. In other words, we negotiate meaning. We negotiate with other cultures. We have to find out what the rules are in that culture and what it is we want to, what we need to find out in order to function in it. If I approach some new culture, and the example I would give, in Nebraska, we happen to have people that are refugees from southeast Burma, and that's the old term. It's called Myanmar. Used to be called French Siam or something like that. The King of Siam, you may have seen The King and I, an old musical. But basically, it is a group of people, refugees from there. I don't know much, if anything, about them. I know some because I know they're from Southeast Asia, but I also know they're not Cambodian. Kampuchea is the name of that country. They're not Vietnamese. They're not Laotian. They're not Hmong, like you saw in the movie New Faces of Main Street. They're not on a video where I can look up stuff on Wikipedia about them. But what do you do when you run into a new culture like that? That's really the point of this little statement, is that you have to find informants. You have to find people. That's not a very positive word, but it means people that give you information about something. They're not betraying anybody, but you find out what are the values of that culture. That's when we get into subjective culture, because I said, what's the relationship between men and women in that culture? How is family life in that culture? What about their language? What do they value in terms of relationships to the elderly in their culture? And you have to make all kinds of assessments. It's really quite interesting when you're dealing with a new culture. You're constantly in a state of discovery, and it's really cool because you're just saying, wow, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. When people have a predisposition or an active prejudice or a bias, or just, you could get down all the way to racism, and they say, well, that culture is this way. Whatever they see, they interpret in their very narrow way. If they see an individual going down the street and they've got a very negative attitude, I remember some people in Lexington where I live, they'd see somebody going down the street, and if it's 4 individuals from a certain country that weren't from town, the potential gang there, or maybe they're out shoplifting or something like that. And people just constantly impose whatever they've got. And that in itself is part of the human tendency. I mean, you don't have anything else, so you just start doing with whatever you have. And if you're not prepared, then you make a lot of you tend to make negative. You don't think 4 guys walking up to your car in the dark, oh, they must need a ride, I'll just open the door. If you know them, if you think they're a certain group, then you don't perceive a threat. But I want to get beyond on this PowerPoint, just thinking about culture as a definition of something, Yeah, there is a definition of the term culture, but we have this thing we carry around with us, and you can call it a rubric, you can call it a value system, you can call it your radar, and if you detect something that is new or unusual, probably due to genetics or something, when we run into something totally new, we usually hesitate about it. That's Three Stooges, that's my old buddy. But nevertheless, culture is something you carry around with you like I don't call it baggage, I just call it your worldview. And you're going to run into people who have a different worldview. What are you going to do about it? And, I started out, I was just going to talk about this PowerPoint, but it's pretty clear. Question is, what do? You teach kids about the black and white definition of culture. This is an arrowhead. It's from the culture of the Paleolithic Native Americans that lived here 1,000 years ago, whatever you want to put on it. But in the here and now, we have Native Americans. The arrowhead is not really relevant to them. You have to deal with their culture as it is now within, 21st century. Some of you have that, very lucky to have the opportunity to work with Native Americans. culture is not just ethnic, of course. It can be culture by ability, or if you want to say disabilities. I'm always careful about a lot of terms. I like to step gingerly there. But caution and embracement, I think, are the two things you have to do. You know. Okay, well, I'm going to let this video run out now. I hope you have a good Labor Day tomorrow. I think I just want to keep it a little bit light this week. I taught this in the summer, and we just had to jam, and I hate that. I want you to look at the PowerPoint, look at this video. Maybe this is a little confusing, but at least I make new ones for you every time. I don't, I'm not taking something from 2 years ago and talking about, you know, something that's chronologically is anachronistic, that stuff about situations then would not be relevant now. So any comments, I'm welcome those. I'll probably give you an assignment next week. Now well, of course I'll give you an assignment next week. I wanted to kind of keep it light this week. I may put a video on, I'm not sure, other than this one, just to watch. I have one I want you to watch, but it's not a pleasant one. It's not about, it's kind of about the stuff I'm talking about now, about conflict between cultures. And I have a framework that I'll attach with that. I believe that is next week. But I may give you a preview and let you at least watch it one time through, just because it gets you stirred up. You know, there's real substance to multicultural education. We're not here just to talk about tamales and Cinco de Mayo and Kwanzaa and all kinds of interesting little curious things that you'll never have to actually deal with unless you're on Jeopardy and you want to win. But things that have substance and you'll have to deal. And a lot of you are dealing with those. So thank you very much.